The air in the chamber was a carefully curated lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, a sterile void engineered to prevent the intrusion of biology into the pristine theatre of diplomacy. Elian breathed it in, a slow, measured inhalation that did not fill his lungs, and felt the familiar chill of the suppressant gel cool the skin at the base of his neck. It was his leash, his armor, the chemical whisper that kept the animal within him sleeping. He sat at the nexus of two immense and opposing forces, a single quiet point of balance, in a room built for confrontation. To his left, the consortium delegation, led by director Aris Thorne, was a study in pale chrome and white synthetics, their posture as rigid as their ideology. Thorne's gaze, a flat, analytical grey, occasionally flickered toward Elian, not with concern, but with the detached scrutiny of an engineer checking a critical component. Elian was his creation, his harmonizer, the culmination of a program designed to weaponize peace. An Omega bioengineered to emit calming pheromones, his very presence meant to soothe the primal territorialism of alphas and facilitate logic. He was a tool, exquisitely designed and ruthlessly effective. He was not a person. He was a function. Across the polished obsidian table, the hegemony delegation was a stark contrast of shadow and raw power. Clad in the deep charcoals and gunmetal greys of their military, they seemed to absorb the light Thorne's faction so readily reflected. At their head sat General Kalen Var, an alpha whose stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. He did not move. He did not fidget. He simply occupied his space with an unnerving totality, his presence a gravitational force that bent the room's sterile atmosphere around him. His eyes, the color of burnt gold, were fixed on the shimmering data slate floating between the two parties. Yet Elian felt their weight, a peripheral pressure that prickled the hairs on his arms. The general's scent was a tightly controlled whisper of ozone and scorched earth, a storm held in check by formidable will. It was the scent of power, ancient and absolute. It was everything Elian had been conditioned to pacify, to fear, to neutralize. The negotiations had stalled, as they always did, on the demarcation of the Seraphim belt. Words, precise and cold, were exchanged like surgical instruments, each one meant to dissect, to wound, to claim. Elian felt the subtle shift in the room's emotional tenor, the rising tide of aggression that was his cue. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, focusing inward past the chemical dampeners to the core of his conditioning. He let his own scent bleed into the recycled air, a soft, unobtrusive fragrance of chamomile and cool riverstone, a scent engineered to suggest tranquility, submission, safety. It was a lie, just like the air, a beautiful, carefully constructed lie. He felt the tension in the room ease by a fractional degree. Shoulders relaxed, jaws unclenched, the sharp edges of alpha posturing softened. It was working. Thorne's lips thinned in what might have been a flicker of approval. Var, however, did not relax. Instead, his head lifted slowly, those predatory golden eyes leaving the data slate and fixing, for the first time, directly on Elian. The gaze was not aggressive. It was curious, inquisitive, like a wolf tilting its head at an unfamiliar sound in the forest. Elian felt a strange, unwelcome heat bloom in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with his function. It was a flicker of something old, something buried. He pushed it down, reinforcing the cool, placid scent of peace. But then came the tremor. It began deep within him, a low, seismic vibration that the suppressants should have made impossible, a cellular rebellion. The gel on his neck suddenly felt useless, a cold placebo against a rising fever. The scent of chamomile and stone began to waver, a fragile melody disrupted by a dissonant, rising note. A scent of something else, something wild and sweet and desperate. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of his professional calm. This was not possible. The regimen was flawless. The dosage was absolute. He was a closed system, a perfect instrument. He was not supposed to break. He was not supposed to feel. He risked a glance at Thorn. The director's eyes were narrowed, the grey irises contracting to pinpoint pupils. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. Thorn missed nothing. A subtle signal was exchanged between the director and his aide, a language of flicking fingers and microscopic shifts in posture. A command, an assessment, a contingency. But it was too late. The tremor became a wave, a surge of heat that washed through his bloodstream, making the sterile air feel thick and suffocating. The carefully constructed scent of riverstone shattered, replaced by the burgeoning fragrance of rain-soaked soil and night-blooming jasmine, a desperate, fertile perfume that was his and his alone. It was the scent of an Omega in distress, the scent of an Omega entering an unscheduled, impossible heat. The room's manufactured peace evaporated in an instant. The alphas on both sides of the table stiffened, their heads snapping up, nostrils flaring. The primal, buried part of their genetics, the part that treaties and technology were meant to chain, was stirring. The air, once a sterile void, was now electric, with a biological reality that defied negotiation. And Kalen Var's golden eyes were no longer curious. They were dark, blazing with a sudden, possessive fire that stripped Elian bare, seeing not the harmonizer, not the tool, but the Omega beneath. The room, which had been a stage for a cold war, was about to become a hunting ground. Elian's breath hitched, a soft, terrified sound in the sudden, predatory silence. The lie was broken, and the truth was going to be the death of them all. The silence that fell was not empty. It was thick, heavy, charged with the catastrophic failure of chemistry and the triumph of instinct. It was the silence of predators who have caught a sudden, intoxicating scent on the wind. Elian felt his own body betraying him, with every frantic pulse of his heart, each beat pushing more of his unscheduled, unshielded scent into the air. The fragrance of jasmine and wet earth was no longer a subtle note. It was a siren's call, a desperate biological scream that filled every corner of the negotiation chamber. He could feel the shift in the alphas around him, a physical change. Their placid, diplomatic facades were cracking, revealing the raw dominance beneath. The hegemony warriors, who had been slouched in calculated indifference, were now coiled springs of muscle, their eyes fixed on him with a stark, unnerving intensity. Even Thorn's consortium delegates, men of science and logic, were affected. Their breathing had deepened, their pupils were dilated, and their hands rested on the table with a white-knuckled tension that belied their commitment to emotional suppression. They were fighting it, but the fight itself was a testament to the power of what was happening. This was a language older than words, older than treaties. It was the language of blood and bone. Thorn was the first to move, his motion economical and precise. He rose, not with alarm, but with the cold fury of a scientist whose experiment had just catastrophically malfunctioned. "This session is concluded," he stated, his voice a blade of ice cutting through the thick, scented air. Unit 734 requires immediate recalibration. Unit 734. That was his designation, not Elian. Never Elian. The name was a ghost, a relic of a life before the consortium had repurposed him. The term recalibration was a sterile euphemism for a process of flushing his system, reinforcing his conditioning, and punishing the biological deviancy. It was a clinical horror he had not experienced since his initial training. He felt a tremor of pure fear, separate from the fever of his heat. Two of Thorn's guards, betas clad in stark white armor, moved toward him. Their faces were impassive behind their sealed helmets, but they moved with a grim purpose that made his blood run cold. They were going to drag him from the room like a faulty piece of equipment. He was an asset to be secured. He was an error to be corrected. He will go nowhere. The voice was a low growl, a resonant bass that vibrated in Elian's very bones. It was General Kalen Var. He had not risen. He remained seated, a monolith of controlled power, but his entire posture had changed. He was no longer a diplomat. He was a warlord. His golden eyes, blazing with an almost preternatural light, were locked on Thorn. It was a direct challenge, a line drawn in the sand of that obsidian table. You have lost control of your asset, Director. The word was laced with a deep, cutting contempt. By the old laws, by the very nature you sought to medicate out of existence, he is no longer your property to recalibrate. Var's gaze shifted to Elian, and the intensity of it was a physical blow. It was possessive, assessing, and yet, underneath the primal fire, there was something else, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were seeing not just an Omega, but a person for the very first time. An Omega in heat seeks a nest, protection, not a laboratory. Thorn's lips curled into a sneer of pure disdain. Your old laws are the reason our species nearly tore itself apart, General. We have evolved beyond such barbarism. The unit has malfunctioned. It will be contained and repaired. This is a consortium matter. He gestured sharply to his guards. Secure him. The white armored guards took another step forward. In response, Var's two personal guards, hulking alphas in black hegemony armor, rose in a single, fluid motion. The sound of their magnetic boots clamping to the floor was a percussive declaration of war. They placed themselves between the consortium guards and Elian, their hands resting on the grips of the pulse rifles strapped to their thighs. The air crackled. The scent of ozone from Var's barely suppressed pheromones mingled with Elian's jasmine, creating a volatile, explosive perfume. Elian was trapped in the center of it all, the epicenter of a conflict he had been designed to prevent. His body was a furnace, and his mind was a maelstrom of fever, fear, and a terrifying, burgeoning need that his conditioning could no longer contain. He looked from Thorn's cold, clinical rage to Var's burning, possessive stillness. One saw him as a broken machine, the other a prize to be claimed. Neither saw him. Neither saw Elian. He was not an asset. He was not a prize. The thought was a small, desperate spark in the overwhelming darkness of his fever. He pressed his hands against the cool surface of the table, trying to ground himself as the world tilted on its axis. The guards stared each other down. The delegates were frozen, caught between two immovable forces. The peace talks were over. A new negotiation had begun, and its currency was not territory or resources. It was him, and the price, he suspected, would be paid in blood. The standoff stretched, a taut wire of silence pulled to its breaking point. The only sounds were the hum of the station's life support and Elian's own ragged breathing. Each exhalation a fresh wave of intoxicating scent that fueled the fire. The hegemony guards stood like statues of granite, their unhelmeted faces grim, their eyes promising violence. The consortium guards, anonymous behind their sterile white faceplates, remained poised, their internal comms likely crackling with Thorn's cold, precise orders. Elian felt like a specimen under glass, the object of a ferocious, primal dispute he could barely comprehend through the haze of his fever. His vision swam, the sharp lines of the room blurring at the edges. The faces of the delegates became distorted masks of aggression and alarm. He was losing himself, his consciousness fraying, dissolving into the purely instinctual agony of his heat. His body screamed for something his mind could not name, a deep cellular craving for safety, for a nest, for the grounding presence of a dominant alpha. It was a biological imperative he had been trained his entire life to view as a pathology, a weakness to be eradicated. Now that pathology was the only real thing in the room. Thorn, ever the strategist, broke the impasse not with force, but with a quiet, venomous pronouncement. General, your interference in the internal affairs of a consortium asset is a direct violation of the Ethelberg Accords. This is an act of aggression. He spoke to Var, but his cold grey eyes were fixed on Elian, a look of profound disappointment, as if a favoured complex machine had developed a fatal, unforgivable flaw. You are attempting to seize strategic personnel. That is a justification for war. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. War. The very thing this station, these talks, his entire existence as a harmonizer was meant to prevent. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He had become the catalyst. His broken body was the spark that would ignite the galaxy. Kalen Var laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from the depths of his chest, the sound of shifting tectonic plates. War? He repeated, his voice dripping with derision. You would burn star systems to the ground for the right to drag a suffering Omega back to a cage. You speak of barbarism, Director, but your science is the cruelest form of it. He finally rose to his full, imposing height, dwarfing everyone else at the table. He was a creature of myth in a room of sterile modernity. This is not about strategy, not anymore. His gaze swept over Elian, and for a moment the fire in his eyes softened with something that looked impossibly like empathy. This is about nature, something your sterile little faction has forgotten. You do not recalibrate a soul. The word soul struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. It was a concept so alien to his conditioning, so thoroughly excised from his understanding of himself, that hearing it spoken in this room in reference to him felt like a hallucination. He was Unit 734, a bio-construct, a system of pheromonal outputs. He did not have a soul. Did he? The question was a crack in the foundation of his identity. Before Thorn could retort, the station's alert klaxons blared to life, a deafening, synthetic shriek that shattered the last vestiges of diplomatic decorum. Red emergency lights bathed the room in a hellish crimson glow, strobing across the panicked faces of the delegates. A synthesized female voice, devoid of emotion, echoed from the walls. Security breach in diplomatic sector. Level 1 lockdown initiated. All personnel remain in designated zones. This is not a drill. Thorn's face went rigid with fury. He had initiated the lockdown. It was a move to contain the situation, to trap Var and his delegation, to reassert control. A cold smile touched his lips. He was turning the station itself into Elian's cage. Var, however, did not look surprised. He looked prepared. "Your move, Director," he said, his voice calm amidst the blaring alarms. "You have trapped us all in here with him. A short-sighted decision." The lockdown changed everything. The room was no longer a negotiation chamber. It was a prison, a pressure cooker. The doors hissed shut with a definitive clang of magnetic locks. They were sealed in. The two alphas, their delegations, their guards, and him, the source of the contagion. Elian's fever spiked. The enclosed space amplified his scent, concentrating it until the air was thick and cloying, an intoxicating poison. He could feel the last of his mental defenses crumbling. The disciplined harmonizer was gone, submerged beneath a tidal wave of pure, agonizing instinct. He whimpered, a small involuntary sound of distress that cut through the noise of the alarms. In that instant, both alphas turned to him. The pretense of political maneuvering fell away, and all that remained were two dominant males reacting to the sound of a vulnerable Omega. Thorn's reaction was one of possessive anger. His asset was displaying unsanctioned weakness. Var's was one of raw, protective instinct. His potential mate was in pain. The guards tensed, their hands tightening on their weapons. The delegates scrambled back, trying to put distance between themselves and the epicenter of the impending storm. Elian pushed himself away from the table, stumbling backward until his back hit the cold, unyielding wall of the chamber. He slid down to the floor, curling into himself, trying to make himself small, to disappear. But there was no disappearing, not when his very scent was a beacon in the dark, a territorial flag planted in contested ground. The alarms continued to scream. The red lights pulsed like a frantic heartbeat, and in the center of it all, Elian burned, a sacrifice on the altar of a peace he had just single-handedly destroyed. He was adrift in a sea of sensation, a fever dream painted in strobing crimson. The cold of the bulkhead at his back was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into heat and noise and the suffocating weight of his own scent. The jasmine was overwhelming now, laced with a sharper, more desperate note of pure panic. It was the smell of a trapped animal, and it only served to heighten the tension in the sealed chamber. Through the haze of his delirium, he watched the two alphas. They were no longer speaking to each other. They were communicating in an older, more visceral language. Thorn had moved to stand over him, a tall, sterile silhouette against the flashing red lights. He held a small, metallic device in his hand, a neuro-sedative injector, recalibration, containment. His face was a mask of cold, clinical resolve. He was going to put the animal down, put the machine back in its box. Unit 734. Thorn's voice was unnaturally calm, the voice of a man accustomed to imposing order on chaos. Cease resistance. This is for your own stability, for the integrity of the program. His words were meant to be a trigger, a conditioned command that should have compelled Elian's compliance. But the part of his brain that responded to such commands was currently on fire. Before Thorn could take another step, Var moved. He was not fast, but he was inevitable, a force of nature. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, placing his formidable body between Thorn and Elian. It was a simple, definitive act of protection, a shield of muscle and will. "Touch him, Director," Var's voice was dangerously soft, a low growl that promised retribution. "And your program will be the least of your concerns." He didn't even look at Thorn. His golden eyes were fixed on Elian, who was curled on the floor. The look in them was complex, a turbulent mixture of primal possession and a startling, raw concern. It was a look that bypassed Elian's conditioning and spoke directly to the terrified Omega cowering within. It offered something he had never been offered before, a choice that was not a command. Thorn's hand tightened on the injector. "You are prolonging its suffering. Its hormonal state is unstable. It could be a danger to itself, to us." The use of it was deliberate, a final attempt to dehumanize Elian, to reduce him to a malfunctioning object in the face of Var's dangerously personal interest. "His name is Elian." The words were quiet, spoken by Var, but they landed in the room with the force of a detonating charge. Elian's head snapped up. His own name, a name he hadn't heard spoken with any meaning in a decade, a ghost's name. Hearing it from the lips of this powerful, intimidating alpha was so profoundly shocking, it cut through the fog of his heat for a single, lucid moment. How did he know his name? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The klaxons suddenly cut out, plunging the room into an eerie, pulsing silence, punctuated only by the thrum of the station's emergency power. The red lights continued their silent, rhythmic sweep. In this new, tense quiet, Elian became aware of something else. A memory, fragmented and sharp as broken glass, rising from the depths of his suppressed past. A sterile room, much like this one. A panel of consortium scientists. Thorn, younger, his face just as cold. And another man, a hegemony observer, part of a short-lived prisoner exchange program from before the last war. A man with intense, golden eyes. A man who had looked at him not as a specimen, but as a boy. Var. He had been there. He had seen him years ago, before the final stages of his conditioning, before they had fully buried Elian under Unit 734. He remembered him. Thorn let out a short, sharp breath, a sound of pure frustration. The revelation had cost him a tactical advantage. The asset was no longer an anonymous unit. It had a name. It had a history. "Irrelevant sentimentality," Thorn hissed, raising the injector. "Stand aside, General." Var didn't move. No. The single word was absolute. It was a law unto itself. The standoff had reached its apex. The two guards from each side mirrored their leaders, weapons now raised to a low ready, safeties disengaged. The delegates, both consortium and hegemony, had flattened themselves against the far wall, their faces pale with the understanding that they were seconds away from being caught in a crossfire. The fate of the galaxy was being decided in a 10-meter radius, dictated by the pheromones of one broken Omega and the wills of two indomitable alphas. And Elian, in that moment of stolen lucidity, realized something terrifying. He did not want Thorn's cold, clinical mercy. He did not want to be sedated, to be erased, to be recalibrated. He feared it more than death. And as he looked at the broad, unyielding back of the man shielding him, he felt a flicker of something other than terror, a fragile, impossible seed of trust. The tension in the sealed chamber became a living entity, coiling in the crimson-lit silence. The air was so thick with pheromones, Elian's distress, Var's protective aggression, Thorn's cold, suppressed fury, that it was almost difficult to breathe. Every particle of recycled air seemed to vibrate with impending violence. Thorn's gambit with the station lockdown had backfired spectacularly. He had intended to isolate and contain a problem, but he had instead created a crucible, forcing a confrontation that could no longer be deferred by protocol or diplomacy. His face, usually a placid mask of control, was taut with a frustration that bordered on rage. His greatest asset had not only failed, but had become the catalyst for an alliance with his most hated rival. The personal nature of Var's defiance, his use of Elian's name, had transformed a logistical issue into an ideological battleground. For Thorn, Elian was the pinnacle of consortium science, the taming of biology, the supremacy of logic over instinct. To see that pinnacle crumble and then be defended by the very embodiment of the primal world he despised was an intolerable insult. "This is madness," Thorn said, his voice a low, seething whisper. "You are championing a biological flaw, a genetic defect. This condition is a weakness we have spent generations trying to engineer out of our species. You would plunge us back into the Dark Ages for the sake of one malfunctioning specimen." Var did not turn. He kept his body positioned as a living wall between Thorn and Elian. "You call it a flaw," he countered, his voice resonant in the quiet room. "I call it life. You see a malfunction. I see a person crying for help. Your progress is a sterile, soulless prison, Director. You strip away everything that makes us who we are and call it evolution." He risked a glance over his shoulder at Elian, his golden eyes searching Elian's face. "Are you a specimen?" The question was soft, but it demanded an answer. It was the first time anyone had asked for his perspective. He was a harmonizer, an object. His opinions were irrelevant, his feelings a data point to be monitored and controlled. The question itself was an act of rebellion against everything Elian had ever known. He tried to speak, to form a word, but his throat was tight with fever and fear. He could only manage a slight, desperate shake of his head. "No, I am not a specimen." The small gesture seemed to be enough. A flicker of grim satisfaction crossed Var's face. He turned his attention back to Thorn. "You heard him." It was a declaration. A new fact had been entered into the equation. The object had expressed a will of its own. This was the final straw for Thorn. The defiance of his asset, compounded by the general's insolence, pushed him past the point of negotiation. The cold logic fractured, and beneath it was a deep, proprietary rage. He had invested years in the Harmonizer program. Elian was his work, his property. "Then you have chosen your side, General." Thorn's voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, save a chilling finality. He subtly shifted his weight, a barely perceptible motion that was a clear signal to his guards. "This station, Ethelberg, is sovereign consortium territory. You are an enemy combatant attempting to seize a high-value asset. I have full authority to neutralize the threat." He raised the neurosedative injector, but he wasn't aiming it at Elian anymore. He was aiming it at Var. It was a foolish, desperate move. The sedative was designed for Omega physiology. Its effect on a prime alpha like Var would be minimal, a momentary sting. But it was the principle. It was an act of assault. It was the first shot. The hegemony guards reacted instantly, their pulse rifles snapping up, the blue light of their charging cells glowing ominously in the dark. The consortium guards mirrored them, their own weapons targeting Var's men. The room, which had been on the verge of violence for what felt like an eternity, was finally about to erupt. Elian saw it happen in slow motion. The glint of the needle in Thorn's hand, the tightening of trigger fingers, the widening of the eyes of the terrified delegates huddled against the wall. This was it. The war was starting here, in this room, over him. And in that moment of terrible clarity, something inside him broke. Not his conditioning, not his body, something deeper. A dam of pain and rage and a lifetime of suppressed identity. He was not a prize. He was not an asset. He was not a justification for bloodshed. The feverish heat in his veins coalesced, focusing into a single point of incandescent energy. His scent, which had been a passive signal of distress, began to change. The soft notes of jasmine and rain-soaked earth were sharpened, infused with the bitter metallic tang of his fear and the ozone of his burgeoning anger. It was no longer a simple pheromonal call. It was becoming something else, a projection, a wave of pure, unadulterated emotion that he pushed out of himself with a silent, desperate scream. He didn't know how he was doing it. It was an instinct he never knew he possessed. He was taking the emotional chaos of the room, the aggression, the fear, the possessiveness, and reflecting it back, amplified 1,000 times. He was becoming the one thing he was never meant to be. He was becoming a weapon. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The charged atmosphere in the room didn't just crack, it shattered. Everyone, alpha, beta, even the technology that governed them, seemed to recoil. The alphas were hit the hardest. Their primal instincts, which Elian's heat had so powerfully aroused, were now being assaulted by a psychic shriek of pure emotional feedback. Var staggered back a step, his hand flying to his temple, a pained grunt escaping his lips. His aggressive posture faltered, the golden eyes blinking in confusion as they were flooded with a raw, empathic agony that was not his own. Thorn cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, dropping the injector as he clutched his head. For a man who lived his life in a fortress of emotional detachment, the sudden, violent intrusion of another's raw feelings was like being set on fire from the inside out. His guards flinched, their aim wavering. The hegemony warriors gritted their teeth, their faces contorting in pain. Even the lumen panels overhead seemed to flicker and dim, as if the station's own systems were struggling to process the anomalous wave of bio-emotional energy. Elian was on his knees now, his head thrown back, his body a conduit for a storm that was tearing the room, and himself apart. The harmonizer, designed to create peace through submission, had just declared war on everyone by weaponizing his own pain. The silence that followed the psychic blast was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born of shock and awe. The delegates stared, their faces slack with disbelief. The guards, on both sides, had lowered their weapons, their training and orders momentarily forgotten in the face of a phenomenon that defied all known parameters of engagement. Elian collapsed onto his side, his body trembling, utterly spent. The effort had drained him, leaving him hollowed out, but the feverish haze had receded. His mind was startlingly clear, like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. The air still carried his scent, but it was different now. It was no longer just the scent of an omega in heat. It was laced with the echo of his power, a ghost of ozone and raw will that served as a potent warning. He had changed the rules of the game. He was no longer the board, no longer the prize. He was a player. Kalen Var was the first to recover. He straightened up slowly, shaking his head as if to clear it of water. He looked not at Thorn, but at Elian, and the expression in his eyes was one of utter astonishment, mingled with a new, profound respect. He had come to claim a rare prize, to act on instinct and tradition. He had found something else entirely, something far more dangerous and far more compelling. Thorn was still on his knees, breathing heavily, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His clinical worldview had been shattered. The neat, predictable systems of biology and conditioning he had mastered had been overturned by a variable he had never conceived of. The asset had developed a soul, and that soul had teeth. He looked at Elian, and for the first time, Director Aris Thorn, the man who saw people as machines, looked afraid. What was that? One of the hegemony delegates whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. There were no words for what had just happened. Elian pushed himself into a sitting position, his muscles screaming in protest. He felt weak, fragile, but a core of something hard and unyielding had formed within him. He met Var's stunned gaze, then Thorn's fearful one. He was still their prisoner, trapped in a locked room on a hostile station, his body still in the throes of a biological crisis. But he was no longer their pawn. "My name," he said, his voice raspy but clear, "is Elian." It was not a plea. It was not a statement. It was a claim, a declaration of his own sovereignty, forged in pain and defiance. He had been a tool for peace and had become a catalyst for war. Now, he would be something else. He would be the one to dictate the terms. The lockdown was still in effect. The red lights still painted the room in the color of blood. But the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The negotiations were about to begin again, and this time he would have a seat at the table. The aftermath of Elian's empathic outburst was a fragile, ringing silence. The two factions, which had been poised on the brink of open warfare, were now united in a shared state of shock. They stared at Elian not as a prize or a problem, but as an unknown quantity, a force that had upended the fundamental laws of their conflict. He was an anomaly that defied both Thorn's science and Var's tradition. He was something new. Var slowly walked toward him, his movements cautious, as if approaching a wild, unpredictable creature. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. The raw, possessive instinct in his eyes had been tempered by something more complex. Awe. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of its earlier aggression. It was a genuine question, one that sought understanding rather than advantage. Elian had no answer. "I don't know," he whispered, the words scraping his throat. It was the truth. The power had come from a place of pure desperation, an instinct for survival that went deeper than the mere desire for a nest or a mate. It was the will to exist as himself. He looked at his own hands, half expecting them to be glowing or changed in some way. They were just hands, pale and trembling. Yet they had just brought two of the most powerful men in the sector to their knees. Thorn finally pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and unsteady. The mask of cold control was back in place, but it was a fragile construct, riddled with cracks. He stared at Elian, his grey eyes wide with a terrifying mix of scientific curiosity and abject horror. The Harmonizer project was his life's work. He had designed Elian to be the ultimate pacifier, a biological failsafe against alpha aggression. To see that creation invert its function to become an empathic weapon of immense power was a refutation of his entire philosophy. He had tried to create a perfect, predictable machine, and instead he had midwifed a god. Or a monster. He wasn't sure which. The empathic projection. It's a theoretical side effect of deep protocol conditioning, Thorn murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Suppressed Omegan abilities, amplified by the neural inhibitors. The stress of the premature heat must have caused a paradoxical reaction. He was trying to rationalize it to fit the miracle, or the catastrophe, into a neat scientific box. He was trying to reclaim control through understanding. It must be contained, studied. The clinical detachment was returning, a defense mechanism against the terrifying reality of what Elian had become. He is not a laboratory animal, Thorn. Var's voice was sharp, cutting through the director's analytical mutterings. He took another step closer to Elian, extending a hand, palm up. It was an offering, not a command, an invitation. Elian, come with me. The hegemony will grant you sanctuary. We will not treat you as an experiment. We will honor you. The offer was tempting. Sanctuary, honor, words he had never been associated with. He looked at Var's outstretched hand. It was large, calloused, the hand of a warrior, but it was steady. It promised strength, protection. It promised a world that acknowledged his nature, even celebrated it, but it was still a world with its own rules, its own cages. The hegemony might not put him in a lab, but they would put him on a pedestal, a revered symbol, another kind of object. A cherished prize was still a prize. He then looked at Thorn. The director's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The scientist in him was fascinated, the strategist was terrified, and the creator, the man who had shaped Elian from a boy into a tool, was profoundly, personally wounded. Unit 734, Thorn said, his voice regaining some of its authority. Your place is with the consortium. We are the only ones who can understand what is happening to you. We can help you control it. We can restore your stability. Control. Stability. The familiar words of his imprisonment. They promised a return to the sterile peace of his former life, a life without feeling, without pain, but also without self. A gilded cage, safe and predictable. 2 offers, 2 futures, both presented by alphas who had, minutes ago, been willing to start a war over him. They still saw him through the lens of their own needs, their own ideologies. Var saw a powerful Omega to be revered and protected. Thorn saw a unique asset to be controlled and utilized. Neither of them saw the terrified, exhausted man huddled on the floor, a man who had just discovered a terrifying power he didn't understand and didn't want. Elian looked from Var's hand to Thorn's face. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting for his choice, waiting for him to align himself with one side or the other. He was once again the fulcrum upon which their conflict balanced. But something had changed within him. The power he had unleashed had not just been a weapon against them. It had also been a key, unlocking a part of himself he never knew existed. A part that was tired of being defined by others. He pulled his knees to his chest, ignoring Var's hand, and looked at the locked door of the negotiation chamber. No, he said, his voice gaining a small measure of strength. Both alphas stared at him, confused. No, Var repeated, lowering his hand. No to what? Elian finally met their eyes, his own gaze clear and steady despite the exhaustion that racked his body. No to you, he said, looking at Var. And no to you, he said, turning his gaze to Thorn. I am not your sanctuary. I am not your experiment. I will not be your reason for war, and I will not be your tool for peace." A stunned silence greeted his declaration. It was an unthinkable choice, the choice of neither. He was rejecting both power structures, both protectors, both captors. He was choosing himself. "Then what do you want?" Thorn asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Elian looked back at the sealed door, at the emergency lights that still pulsed their silent, crimson warning. "I want out," he said simply. "Open the door. End the lockdown. Let me walk out of this room. Alone." It was an impossible demand, but he had just done the impossible. And in the stunned, calculating eyes of the two most powerful men he had ever met, he saw a flicker of something new. Not possession, not clinical interest, but the dawning, terrifying realization that they were no longer in control. The audacity of Elian's demand hung in the air, a third pole in the conflict, a declaration of independence so profound it left both Thorn and Var momentarily speechless. He had refused the cage, no matter how gilded or how secure. In their world, a world defined by power, allegiance, and control, his desire for simple, solitary freedom was the most radical stance he could possibly take. He was a piece on the board declaring itself a player, and in doing so, threatening to upend the entire game. Thorn was the first to find his voice, his disbelief curdling into a familiar, condescending tone. "Out? Out where, Unit 734? The station is on full security alert because of your episode. There is nowhere for you to go. Your request is illogical. You are an Omega in an unsuppressed heat cycle. You would not survive an hour without protection." He gestured to the room around them. "This chamber, for now, is the safest place for you. Your only viable options are under my authority or his." He was trying to force Elian back into the binary choice, to reassert the old reality where the only safety lay in submission to a stronger power. He was wrong. The room was not safe. It was a cage with two wardens. "He is right about the danger," Var conceded, his voice a low rumble of concern. He had not taken his eyes off Elian, and his gaze was intense, searching. But not about the options. He turned to face Thorn fully, the brief truce of shock now over. A new negotiation was beginning, but the subject had changed. It was no longer about possession, but about Elian's stated will. "End the lockdown, Thorn. Let his ship be prepared. The hegemony will guarantee his safe passage through our territory. We will not pursue him. We will not interfere. We will give him what he asks for." It was a staggering concession. For a hegemony general, a man whose entire culture was built on strength and acquisition, to voluntarily relinquish a claim on an Omega of such unprecedented power was unthinkable. It was a gesture of either immense strategic foresight or genuine, shocking respect. Thorn stared at Var, his mind clearly racing, processing the new variables. He saw the trap. If he refused, he would be the tyrant, the one denying Elian's agency, pushing him directly into the hegemony's sphere of influence. If he agreed, he would be letting his most valuable and now most dangerous asset walk out the door. An asset that had just demonstrated the ability to incapacitate alpha soldiers with a thought. "You would just let him go?" Thorn asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "This power he has. It could shift the balance of the entire sector. You would let that variable walk away unclaimed?" "He has already made it clear he will not be claimed," Var stated simply. "To try would be to invite a war with him, not just with you. and I am not convinced that is a war either of us could win." He looked back at Elian. "He has earned his freedom. He took it. All we can do is acknowledge the fact." The room was quiet as Thorn weighed his options. The delegates watched, holding their breath. The guards remained at ease, but alert. The fate of everything now rested on the director's cold, calculated decision. Elian watched him, his heart pounding. His body still ached with the phantom pains of the heat, a dull, throbbing need that was now overshadowed by a fierce, desperate hope. He had spoken his truth. He had made his demand. He did not know what he would do if he walked out that door, where he would go. The universe was a vast, terrifying place for a lone Omega, especially one like him. But the terror of the unknown was infinitely preferable to the certainty of the cages being offered. Finally, Thorn gave a slow, deliberate nod. His face was a stone mask, betraying nothing of the strategic calculations or the personal defeat that must have been churning within him. "Very well," he said, his voice clipped and precise. He walked over to the main control panel near the door, his movements rigid. He tapped a sequence onto the glowing surface. A moment later, the synthesized female voice returned, calm and clear. Level 1 lockdown disengaged. Security alert rescinded. All systems returning to normal status. The red emergency lights died, replaced by the cool, neutral white of the room's standard illumination. The effect was jarring, like waking from a nightmare. The oppressive, hellish atmosphere vanished, leaving behind a sterile, ordinary room where something extraordinary had just occurred. The heavy magnetic locks on the door disengaged with a soft hiss. Freedom was a quiet sound. Thorn turned back, his grey eyes locking onto Elian. "A shuttle has been prepared in Docking Bay 7. It is unarmed, but has a long-range FTL drive. It will not be tracked." He was letting him go, really letting him go. There was a price, of course. There was always a price with Thorn. "The consortium will consider you a rogue agent. The Harmonizer program is now classified at the highest level. If you reveal its existence or the nature of your abilities, we will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy. You will be granted this one chance to disappear. Do not waste it." It was a threat, but it was also a lifeline. Disappear. Become a ghost. It was more than Elian had ever hoped for. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet, using the wall for support. His legs were unsteady, but he stood. He looked at Thorn, the man who had made him, and saw not a monster, but a man blinded by his own rigid logic, a man who had lost something vital in his quest for control. He felt a flicker of something that was almost pity. Then he looked at Var, the man who had tried to claim him, and saw not a barbarian, but a man who, in the end, had been capable of listening, of changing, a man who had seen a soul and chosen to honor it. "Thank you," Elian said, the words directed at them both. It felt strange to thank his jailers, but they had both, in their own way, given him the key. Thorn did not acknowledge his thanks. He simply turned away, already focused on damage control, on salvaging his program and explaining the catastrophic failure of the peace talks. Var, however, held his gaze. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. Elian took a deep breath of the newly clean, unscented air and walked toward the door. Each step was an effort, but each one took him further from the man he had been. He did not look back. He walked out of the negotiation chamber, out of his prison, and into the vast, uncertain promise of a future that was, for the very first time, his own. The corridors of Ethelberg Station were a silent, sterile labyrinth of white and grey. The normal hum of activity had ceased, a lingering effect of the lockdown. It was as if the station itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Elian walked, his steps still unsteady, his body a battlefield of warring sensations. The heat had not vanished, it had merely subsided from a raging inferno to a bed of smouldering coals, a constant, aching reminder of his biological reality. But for the first time, the ache was his own. It was not a malfunction to be corrected or a weakness to be exploited. It was simply a part of him, the man named Elian. He followed the glowing directional panels toward Docking Bay 7, his mind a strange mix of crystalline clarity and profound exhaustion. He was a ghost moving through a world he was never meant to see on his own terms. Every person he passed, a stray technician, a maintenance drone, a pair of beta security officers, averted their eyes. News, or at least rumor, must have traveled with the speed of light through the station's comms. He was the Omega who had broken the peace talks, the anomaly who had brought two alpha leaders to a standstill. He was an object of fear and fascination. He was no longer invisible. Docking Bay 7 was cavernous and quiet. A single ship rested in the docking clamps, a small, sleek courier vessel, its hull a nondescript graphite color. It was anonymous, perfect for disappearing. The boarding ramp was down, an invitation into the unknown. As he approached, a figure stepped out from the shadows beside the ramp. It was Lena, the beta attendant who had been assigned to him, the one who brought him his meals and his suppressants with quiet, efficient hands and eyes that never quite met his. She held a small, insulated pack in her hands. "They ordered me to provision the ship," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper. She did not call him Unit 734. She did not call him Elian. She simply spoke to him as a person. "There is water, nutrient paste, and medical supplies, and—" She hesitated, then held out the pack. "I included a cycle kit for the heat. It's not a suppressant. It will not stop it, but it might help with the fever and the pain." Elian stared at her, stunned. A cycle kit was standard issue for Omegas in the general populace, but it was something he had never been allowed. His cycles were meant to be non-existent, chemically erased. For Lena to have procured one for him was an act of quiet, profound rebellion. It was an acknowledgement of his humanity, of his suffering. It was, in its own way, a greater gift than the ship itself. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Gratitude felt too small a word. Lena finally looked at him directly, and he saw in her plain, tired eyes a depth of empathy he had never noticed before. "I was assigned to the Harmonizer program for 5 years," she said. "I watched them make you. I watched them take a boy and turn him into a function." She looked away, toward the cold, distant stars visible through the bay's massive viewport. "No one deserves to be a function." She pushed the pack into his hands. Her fingers were warm against his skin. It was the first gentle human touch he had felt in as long as he could remember. "Go," she whispered. "Don't look back. Don't let them find you." And then she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the sterile corridors of the station. A small, quiet act of grace in a galaxy built on power and control. Elian clutched the pack to his chest and boarded the ship. The cockpit was small, functional, designed for a single pilot. The controls glowed with a soft blue light. He sat in the pilot's chair, the worn synth leather cool against his feverish skin. He ran the pre-flight sequence, his hands moving with a muscle memory he didn't know he possessed, a remnant of the basic skills training the consortium had deemed necessary for their asset. The ship hummed to life around him. The docking clamps retracted with a heavy clang. He was free. He guided the small vessel out of the docking bay, into the silent, star-dusted void. Ethelberg Station hung behind him, a beautiful spinning jewel of white and silver, a monument to a peace he had been created to serve and had been forced to break. Through the cockpit's viewport, he could see the two capital ships holding their positions in orbit. The sleek, clinical spearhead of the consortium fleet and the brutalist, imposing dreadnought of the hegemony. They were still there, watching him, two predators held in a tense, uncertain truce. He knew they were letting him go, for now. Thorn would try to bury the incident to salvage his program, perhaps by creating a new, more compliant harmonizer. Var would return to his fleet, the story of the powerful, defiant Omega, becoming a legend whispered in the halls of the hegemony, a cautionary tale about the consortium's hubris. They would go back to their Cold War, their conflict postponed, not resolved. The galaxy was unchanged, but he was not. He keyed in a destination, a random set of coordinates in the unaligned territories of the Outer Rim, a place where empires frayed at the edges, a place where a ghost could disappear. The nav computer chimed its acceptance. He pushed the throttle forward and the ship's engines flared to life, a silent, brilliant bloom of blue energy. Then he engaged the FTL drive. The stars outside the viewport streaked, elongated, and collapsed into a tunnel of shimmering, incandescent light. He was moving faster than light, faster than sound, away from his past, away from his name, away from the men who had sought to own him. The ship jumped, and the universe outside became a swirling vortex of impossible colors. He was alone, in the throes of his heat, in a stolen ship, with no one to trust and nowhere to truly call home. He was a rogue agent, a broken tool, a biological anomaly. But as he gripped the controls, the low thrum of the ship's engine a steadying presence, he felt something he had never felt before. He was free, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. The transition from FTL travel was always disorienting, a lurch in the gut as reality reasserted itself with brutal suddenness. The swirling vortex of light collapsed, resolving into a static, silent tapestry of unfamiliar stars. Elian's small ship drifted in the deep black, the engines humming a low, steady tune. He was in the Outer Rim, in a sector of space marked on the nav charts with designations like unexplored and hazardous. It was a place of forgotten colonies, pirate enclaves, and celestial phenomena that defied consortium science. It was a place where empires came to die. It was perfect. The heat was still a fire in his blood, a constant, debilitating companion. The cycle kit Lena had given him offered some relief. The analgesic patches dulled the worst of the cramps, and the cooling compresses helped manage the fever. But it could not touch the deep primal ache, the psychological craving for a nest, for security, that was the core of the experience. In the sterile confines of the cockpit, he was more aware than ever of his own solitude. He was a beacon of scent in an empty void, calling out to no one. Days bled into one another, marked only by the ship's chronometer and the cycle of his own fitful sleep. He spent the time learning his ship, studying its systems, pushing it to its limits in the empty stretches between asteroid fields and nebulae. The vessel was more than just a transport. It was his shell, his armor, his only home. He learned the quirks of its engine, the dead zones in its sensor array, the way it shuddered when pushed too hard. It was a flawed, anonymous thing, just like him. He also spent time exploring himself. The power he had unleashed in the negotiation chamber was dormant, a sleeping giant within him. He would meditate in the pilot's chair, closing his eyes and try to feel it, to touch its edges. He found it coiled deep inside, a nexus of energy tied to his emotions. When he was calm, it was a placid pool. When he felt a spike of fear or a pang of loneliness, it would stir, a flicker of ozone in his mind. He was terrified of it, of what it could do, of what it said about what he was. Was he a new kind of Omega, or just a broken one? Thorne's words echoed in his memory, a paradoxical reaction. He had been designed for peace, and the system had overloaded, inverting his function. He was a living irony, a testament to the consortium's failure to account for the resilience of the soul. He kept his comms system dark, listening, but never transmitting. The galactic news feeds were a carefully curated stream of propaganda from both sides. There was no mention of the Ethelberg incident. It had been buried, classified, as Thorne had promised. The official story was that the peace talks had reached a temporary impasse and would resume at a later date. The galaxy remained on a knife's edge, blissfully unaware that its fate had been decided not by treaties or armies, but by the biological rebellion of a single, broken Omega. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of interstellar space, he would think of them. Thorne, with his cold, analytical eyes, likely already grooming a new candidate for the Harmonizer program, reinforcing the protocols, determined not to repeat his mistakes. And Var. He thought of Var more often. He remembered the general's raw power, the possessive fire in his eyes, but he also remembered the shocking moment of empathy, the quiet offering of his name, the final, respectful nod. Var was a man of instinct, a man of the old laws, but he had shown a capacity to see beyond them, to recognize a will independent of his own. It was a dangerous, complicated memory. After weeks of aimless drifting, his supplies began to run low. The nutrient paste was bland, tasteless sustenance, but it was finite. He needed to find a place to land, to resupply, to trade. He needed to step back into the world. He scanned the local star charts and found a small, independent trading post on a barren moon called Kestus 3. It was listed as a haven for smugglers, prospectors, and others who preferred to live outside the gaze of the major powers. It was a place where no one asked questions as long as you had credits to spend. It was a risk. His scent, even at the low ebb of his cycle, was still distinctly Omegan. A lone Omega in a lawless place was a target. But staying in the ship forever was not freedom. It was just a different kind of cage. He would have to learn to protect himself. He landed the ship in a crowded, chaotic docking bay, filled with scarred freighters and patched-up mining vessels. The air in the station was a thick soup of smells: ozone from leaky power conduits, spicy food from a nearby cantina, the unwashed scent of too many bodies in a confined space. It was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the sterile environments he was used to, but it was also vibrant. It was the smell of life, messy and uncontrolled. He disguised himself as best he could, wearing a heavy hooded cloak and a breather mask that would hopefully obscure his scent. He kept his head down, his hands in his pockets, and tried to project an aura of someone you didn't mess with. It was a fragile bluff. He traded some of the ship's redundant power cells for credits at a dusty, automated kiosk, then moved through the marketplace, buying water, food, and a few spare parts. The station was a microcosm of the galaxy's forgotten people. Aliens of a dozen species haggled with grizzled human prospectors. Droids, dented and worn, carried heavy loads. In a dark corner, a group of rough-looking alphas were gambling, their laughter loud and coarse. He felt their eyes on him as he passed, a prickle of instinctual awareness. They might not have consciously identified his scent, but on a primal level, they sensed something different about him, something other. He quickened his pace, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. This was the reality of his freedom. It was a constant, vigilant state of self-preservation. As he was about to head back to his ship, a news broadcast flickered to life on a large public view screen. It was a hegemony feed. The face of Kalen Var filled the screen. He was in his full-dress uniform, standing on the bridge of his dreadnought. He looked every bit the powerful, indomitable warlord. He was announcing a new military exercise along the border of the Seraphim Belt, a clear message of strength directed at the consortium. But his eyes, as he spoke of strategy and dominance, Elian saw the same intensity in them he had seen in the negotiation chamber, the same focus, and he had the unnerving feeling that the general's words were not just for the consortium. They were a message broadcast into the void, a reminder of his presence, a whisper that he had not forgotten. The camera zoomed in on Var's face, and for a fleeting second, Elian felt a strange, impossible connection across the light years, a phantom echo of the empathic link he had forged in that room. It was a chilling, terrifying thought. He had run to the edge of the galaxy to be free, but he was beginning to suspect that for men like Var and Thorn, the galaxy was not nearly big enough. He pulled his hood lower and hurried back to the safety of his ship. The general's face burned into his mind. He had escaped his past, but it seemed his past was not yet finished with him.